Hi everybody, thanks for having me. I want to talk for 20 minutes about the impacts of surface floodwater on basements. I think to introduce it, we're all aware that surface floodwater events are becoming more common, driven by climate change. About a year ago, London was semi-underwater as a result of excessive rainfall and the resulting backflow from drains and surcharge sewers and things like that. The new standard BS8 102/2022 identifies and acknowledges the risks posed to basements from surface floodwater, and we're going to have a look at that and the implications or potential implications for our industry and how we might deal with the risks posed by surface water flooding in basement waterproofing. So it's quite a big subject. I hope you like the angle that I've taken on to kind of recap on how we might approach this quite big subject, really. Helps if we have a definition. So if we want to kind of categorise what surface water flooding is, it's otherwise known as pluvial flooding, okay? So a bit like the French la pluie, the rain, pluvial flooding. And it basically occurs when there's a hell of a lot of rainfall in a very short space of time. The ground can't absorb it, it can't soak away through sustainable urban drainage systems. The surface water and sewage system is surcharged and it can actually bubble up and come out of the ground as well. So it's really a lack of management of the urban environment to cope with this amount of water in such a short space of time. So simply put, there's nowhere for the rainwater to go except overland in terms of an overland flow. So we know that climate change, I think it's widely acknowledged, is driving more and more frequent flood events and rainfall. If you go on the Met Office website and take a few snapshots and statistics, you can see that this one from 2020, it had upwards of 300% of the average rainfall for December of that year, And there's lots and lots of maps like this. You can go online and you can have a look at the pattern of rainfall becoming more and more prevalent and more extreme. So what is a basement then? Well, a basement's really a giant sump into which water can flow from an overland flow perspective, and it can fill it up basically. And it can stay in it for a very long time because a basement's a low point, and it can stay trapped in voids and in finishes, and it can be very difficult to get rid of, and drying it out isn't really an option as we'll look at. It's a much more complicated problem to deal with. So a basement is a particularly at-risk part of the building. If I take you to July 2021, and if you were to visit the Thames Water website, there's a few acknowledgements from them about their infrastructure. So in July, London was hit by extreme rainfall, which led to widespread flooding. It's its heaviest. A month's rain, a whole month's rain fell on some parts of the capital in just 1 hour, which is an incredible statistic. The speed, severity, and scale of this rainfall tested our sewers and local authority drains and gullies beyond the limits that they were designed to cope with. So basically the infrastructure isn't adequate to cope with these extreme rainfall and therefore surface flooding events. I'll take you back to London, to North London in this case, a very nice basement apartment which was then up for sale for a nice tidy sum, very high spec finishes, especially the kitchen. The client, we'll call her Mrs. Smith in this case. Her passion was baking, okay, so she spent about £80,000 just on the kitchen, and we've got beautiful parquet oak flooring, and we've got just a generally beautiful place to be. You can see the light well, the sunken garden with the log burner going, and it's a cosy place to live. Now, if the video works, which it does, I want you to watch this 30-second clip because this is the same basement.
Need to work out a way of getting maximum.
Okay, pretty extreme that. So Mrs. Smith actually commissioned me as an expert, if you like, to write a report for insurance purposes mainly, on the effects of surface water flooding on her basement, because when that basement flooded, the water didn't come from the ground, it came overland down the road at about 8 miles an hour, it piled over the light wells, it came from the light wells through the door thresholds, it came up through the toilet, it came up through the wash hand basins, and it came up through the shower trays, yeah? So it was getting hit from multiple angles. So if we refer to some standards now, which I did as part of my report, we've got 85500, which is the kind of go-to standard for flood resilience, really. And it talks about sources of flooding, and it talks about durations and how long they're likely to last. So in this case, Mrs. Smith's basement suffered from the drainage system failure, infrastructure failure, sewers, overland flow, and hit from multiple directions at once. And how did it get in? Well, if we want to go to guidance documents and standards, Syria C790 references potential pathways of floodwater entry into buildings. So there we can see Mrs. Smith suffered from drainage failure up through the floors, via surface entry points, via doors, through air bricks, etc., etc. Yeah, so she was getting hit from multiple angles. So there are reference documents that we can begin to look at when we start to formulate our reports and designs. If we look at the very excellent PCA, Code of Practice for the Recovery of Flood Damaged Buildings, we can also start to get some idea of what the water might have contained that came into Mrs. Smith's apartment, because we're not talking about distilled Buxton spring water here, we're talking about stuff that came up from the sewers, and we're talking about grey water that came from washing up bowls and decayed food matter and things like that. So we've got black water and we've got grey water. So in my risk assessment of the effects, I took these into account, yeah? There's direct references to standards. And let's not forget the overland flow down the road at 8 miles an hour and over the light wells and into Mrs. Smith's apartment would have also contained hydrocarbons, wouldn't it, from fuel and oil on the road. So we've got a real nasty mix as a result of this particular flood. And where did it go? Well, I mean, it was pumped out by the fire brigade. It was dried out by dehumidifiers, which probably destroyed the sort of standard moisture equilibrium of the building while they were doing it. And it went down into the finishes, didn't it, where no one sees it. So when I turned up at Mrs. Smith's apartment, to all intents and purposes, it looked okay, you know. I mean, the parquet flooring was warping and coming away. There was kitchen units that were warping and there were stains and all that, but not as bad as you'd think maybe. But when you scratch the surface and you begin to look at the components of the building, then you begin to see what the true implications are. So if we go again to the PCA Code of Practice, it talks about basements specifically. These are spaces that can harbour and trap water for very long periods of time. We have cavity drainage systems which have multiple studs which can act like little reservoirs or little petri dishes, you know, so bacteria can breed from the sewers. How are we going to get at that? What about chases for pipes, recessed services, things like that? These are little canals, you know, that were never going to be accessed and dry out or clean out or sanitise. And then as part of my report, I look at the historic photographs that Mrs. Smith gave to me. This is how it happened, Michael. This is what happened a year ago when my basement was converted, you know, and refurbished. And I'm looking at the insulation and I'm thinking, blimey, there's no way that's a recoverable material. It's going to be absolutely knackered as a result of this flood. I'm looking at the gypsum plasterboard and I'm looking at the MDF and I'm looking at all sorts of things. And I'm thinking, blimey, you know, this could be a lot worse from a risk assessment point of view than we first anticipated. So were the materials in Mrs. Smith's apartment recoverable? So what does recoverable mean? Well, basically, did the construction materials return to their former properties and performance levels following immersion in water? No. Were any construction material manufacturers or installers' guarantees invalidated as a result of being immersed in water for 7 hours? You bet, absolutely. No guarantees apply now. And were the client's living standards and her mental health and her financial interests, remember the property's up for sale, investments and all that compromised as a result of the flood? Well, I'm not sure that her mental health was recoverable after that, let alone anything else. So the answer is yes. So it's a complete disaster. Now, what could have been done to mitigate the problems? Could the worst of the damage caused by the surface floodwater have been mitigated or avoided? I think there are materials and techniques that maybe could have been put in place if we could be clairvoyant and foreseen the surface water flood. So the answer to that is at least a partial yes. Could it have been kept out of the basement? That's a very good question. Probably not in its entirety, but some of it may have been able to be resisted by the use of flood doors, self-closing air bricks, flood dams, whatever, all these products that are in a related industry to ours, the flood protection industry. And could the source, depth and duration of the surface flood have been predicted? The source may have been able to be predicted. We'll have a look at flood risk areas and maps in a minute. Could the duration and depth of the flood have been predicted? Well, I'm not a rain god, so I don't know. So the answer is probably no, because we don't know. We can't see into the future. But the big question here for me, as basement waterproofing specialists, is the management of risk associated with the effects of surface water flooding in basements our responsibility? Is it? Are we magicians? Do we not have enough on our plate keeping groundwater out? Can we design against force majeure, acts of God, this kind of thing? We're not miracle workers, but we need to acknowledge that this is part of the new standard. So we need an approach to dealing with it, because now it's not to do with groundwater ingress, is it, the standard? It's against water ingress, external sources. So the scope has widened. So initially I went a bit of a Sherlock Holmes route. I went through the standard and I started to identify paragraphs in it that might relate to surface water flooding, as a kind of exercise. And you can read those from there. I won't read them out to you, but it talks about openings and it talks about external sources and it talks about BS 85500, the standard for flood resilience, which is there. So I suggest you all go and get a copy. It talks about death studies, code of practice for ground investigations, which include flood risk. And it talks about the impacts of flooding, which we should establish, the potential for it as part of our basement waterproofing risk assessment. It should take into account climate change, which it already says in the old standard, flooding. And there's the thing about the continuity, isn't there, at 150 above ground level, for surface water. Should we be designing at the new build stage retaining walls which extend to 150 above ground level instead of having a couple of courses of block work on top of a retaining wall with the course of block work being below ground level? All sorts of questions and potential solutions, okay? But the important thing is inflow of surface water, surface pluvial, fluvial's river flooding, a bit like pluvial. But all these surcharging of sewers, all these are references in the standard that we've all got and we've all no doubt read, but it's good to reread and go through it. So where does it leave us, right? Because these are responsibilities that are kind of foisted on us almost, or at least we need a strategy to advise clients in a responsible and productive way. Well, when we're writing reports, I think we need to acknowledge these references in 8102-2022. We need to think of a source pathway receptor, a bit like ground gases. The source is the surface water flood, the pathway is the doorway, the receptor is the insulation, whatever, or the occupant, that kind of mentality. If we are out of our comfort zone, we need to talk to manufacturers of products that we intend to put in the basement conversion, or hydrological engineers and people like that, water companies. We need to understand what resistance, resilience and recoverability is, okay? So resistance is keeping floodwater out. Resilience is the performance of materials and how they react when it gets in. And recoverability is how fast can the client get back in the house, okay? So these are very important principles that we need to think about. And very importantly, we need to define our strategy in our report. In 85500, there's a big thing about planning for water exclusion, so trying to keep flood water out at surface level, but allowing for water entry, okay? So in case it gets in anyway, this is what I'm going to do on the inside to make it less of a misery for Mrs. Smith, so she doesn't have to have it all stripped out back to the bare bones of the structure, so that clients can begin to make cost versus risk decisions about what they're going to have in their basement apart from the groundwater proofing system. And we need to state any many limitations and caveats in our report, which is massively important because you have to state what you're not going to do, yeah? You state what you do and what you can guarantee, and you state what you can't guarantee, because cost and risk is what it's all about with information to clients so they can make the choice on what they spend. So this is a quick table out of 85500. I find it very interesting. It says that for flood events less than 300 millimetres, resistance, so that can be tried, so keeping water out. It says 300 to 600 mil, try and keep it out, but it's going to get in anyway. And for more than 600 mil, it says it's going to get in, but you might have tried to resist it when it tried to, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But there's a caveat on the resistance on the lower flood, which basically says for longer duration flooding, it could require additional resilience. So that table really is evidence that you can't keep surface flood water out of a building, not realistically in terms of guaranteeing it, because we can't test these systems during construction either, can we? Not like we can with Type C waterproofing systems, yeah? So we don't know if it's going to work, so we can't guarantee it. So the answer to that is a big no. Now, in terms of researching and learning more about flood resilience and the industry, you know, there's a whole flood protection industry out there full of experts. Go to Flood Expo every year, have a look at the sandbags and the pumps, you know, and the flood dams and the gates and the flood doors and all that kind of thing. You can refer to those experts in a related industry, which is what I tend to do, and you can look at lots of guidance documents, yeah, including the PCA, Codes of Practice, Environment Agency, all sorts of things readily available on the web. In terms of the risk assessment for Mrs. Smith's house, had that been done? This is a map off .gov. This is a river flooding map, so there's no issues with Mrs. Smith flooding from rivers, yeah, from fluvial flooding. But you look at the surface water flood map, and it says it's at low risk. So if I was writing a report and converting Mrs. Smith's basement in the first place, in the light of the new standard, I would have gone on to the .org and I would have looked at whether there's a potential for flood risk. Okay, so solutions. Well, yeah, there are solutions for everything, no matter how difficult the problem. It's a matter of how we tackle it, okay, in terms of us being basement waterproofing specialists, what are we going to do about these potential risks from surface water flow? Well, we can innovate. There's a lot of expertise in this room to do with managing water and keeping it out and understanding the effects of water on construction materials. So we've all got principles and we've got good knowledge. So we need to think a little bit laterally. Now, there are projects in place already, like Precedence, there's the BRE Flood House in Watford, which has resistance, resilience, water management in it. There's a barn conversion near the River Eden in Carlisle, which is basically designed like a huge shower tray. So it's coated internally with epoxies and materials that are washable and won't absorb and re-emit moisture. That's the inside of it, and it's got removable materials. So the lower portion of plasterboard are removable so they can be accessed and replaced. We've got a job here in Lymm in Cheshire where we're trying to resist water, but we're accepting it's going to get in. So we're going to put tiles on the floor and restoration plaster on the lower part of the slurries you can see there. And there's a basement in Northampton where it's got a suspended beam and block floor. You don't see many of these in basements, do you? But when it flooded, it rose through the floor, lifted the insulation, cracked the screed, and knackered the underfloor heating. So in the refurbishment, we've got resistant insulation bonded down. We're using adhesive and mechanically, and we've got a waterproofing system, and we're putting a waterproof screed on. And I've even put little pressure relief pipes through it so that there isn't too much buoyancy on the floor, depending on how fast it rises, so the water can actually get through and equalise on top of it. Okay, so various little techniques and solutions that I'm personally working on. Go to Flood Expo, engage with the flood protection industry, learn about their techniques, think about how to seal basement waterproofing products to flood doors or air bricks, all that kind of thing, because we need systems, not products really. We need to acknowledge the risk as part of the standard. We need to have an approach to it in terms of how we write our reports and what advice we give to the client to be able to responsibly acknowledge and deal with the requirements of the new standard. Joined up thinking is the key to stellar solutions, yeah? So get out there, innovate, and spread your wings, you know, talk to manufacturers about their products. I'm a bit of a Star Trek fan. to be honest. I always try and get Captain Kirk in my presentations, right? So these delegates at the PCA annual conference are smart cookies, Mr. Spock. So Mr. Sock then. Agreed, Captain. Their receptiveness to acquiring new building preservation knowledge and techniques is admirable and entirely logical. There is much we could learn from them. Set course for the PCA conference, warp factor 12. Thank you very much. Thanks.